Welcome to the House of Take Pod. Today we are going to discuss what happened over at ESPN, which caused it to go ahead and parachute over 20 of its on-air talent. Was it Pat McAfee's fault? Did Stephen A. Smith have something to do with it? Did the departure of Shannon Sharpe, if you will, the divorce from Skip Bayless, have anything to do with the decision that ESPN went ahead and made? That is today's discussion on the House of Takes. All right, let's hear from Stephen A. Smith himself. Let's hear what he has to say.
ESPN laid off about 20 members of its on-air talent. Friends of mine, actually. Definitely respected colleagues who've done a phenomenal job and deserved better. They deserved better than the times we're living in. To see Jalen Rose gone, my brother, got a lot of love for that brother. A lot of the great work he's done over the years, what he's represented for the company. He is a brilliant, brilliant basketball mind. He is somebody that worked his ass off all the time. Jeff Van Gundy's another outstanding, brilliant basketball analyst for ESPN for years. I could say I'm going to miss him, but I just can't imagine he's going to be out of work for long. I'm sure I'll see him on the air doing his thing. Jeff Van Gundy's been a Hall of Fame analyst and commentator. Neil Everett from SportsCenter. Ashley Brewer from SportsCenter. My brother Keyshawn Johnson, my brother. We've been friends for over 20 years. I'm sad to see him go. What he's done for my life, just being a big brother and a friend of me. I love him to death. David Pollack, outstanding college football analyst. Love him. Todd McShay, college football analyst extraordinaire, especially for the NFL draft. And I don't want to mention everybody because I don't want to forget anybody's name. But those names certainly come to mind.
So a little something about Stephen A. Now, the video we just watched, I thought was appropriate for an ESPN host that makes over $10 million a year. Like, what did you think he was going to say? Did you really think that Stephen A. Smith was going to somehow come out against the company that is paying him over $10 million a year? Look, one of the big differences between a Stephen A. Smith and maybe a Susie Colbert or a Steve Young or even a Neil Everett is that Stephen A. Smith actually has an audience outside of ESPN. Now, we know that Stephen A. Smith has his Stephen A. Smith podcast, and that podcast talks about other things than sports. We also know that Stephen A. Smith shows up or used to show up on CNN, tends to show up on Fox every once in a while. He's even on the Sean Hannity show. So there's a political part to Stephen A. that is still a little bit unclear exactly where he falls in the political spectrum. But what we do know is that Stephen A. Smith doesn't want to just be known as a sports guy. And ESPN has allowed him to branch out into other things. I mean, for God's sake, Stephen A. Smith is actually on General Hospital. Some days I walk into our family room and there is Stephen A. Smith, and my wife, who watches General Hospital, will be like, hey, isn't that the sports guy you like watching? So the changes that were made over at ESPN were, of course, financial, and this was, of course, about money, and Disney wanted to stop losing as much money as it was losing on ESPN at this point, which also seems a little bit ridiculous when you think about how well ESPN has done over the years. But what has happened is there has been a significant shift in the sports landscape. The way you and I actually get our sports content today has changed significantly over the last 3 years. Go back to the start of COVID, and you can tell where the shift actually went. Of course, everybody was home. We were all on Zoom calls all day, and that ultimately really translated into a bunch of new sports shows popping up. Now, Pat McAfee was pre-COVID, and the Pat McAfee show actually just exploded onto the scene a while back. And when Pat McAfee really started to take off was when they went ahead and had Aaron Rodgers Tuesday. And look, if I could get Aaron Rodgers on the House of Takes on Tuesdays, I bet you I would have millions of followers too. Just a brilliant move by Pat McAfee, as well as the contract that he signed with the FanDuel network in the first place. That being said, the shift to ESPN seems a little bit obscure, but I think what this was really about for Pat McAfee was an ability to actually hit mainstream television with his brand of sports commentary. And that, my friends, was difficult, was probably a difficult decision. And in fact, at least on paper, it looks like he's gone from 120 million to 85 million. Thus, he's taking less money. My guess is that ESPN's probably now going to pay for all of the ancillary things that Pat McAfee had to pay for when he was at FanDuel. Now, I'm sure at the end of the day, he's still taking a little bit less to join ESPN. That being said, it's probably not as bad as we might think when you factor in all of the other expenses that Pat McAfee had to put together for a show. So the landscape has shifted. There are a ton of really great sports podcasters out there. There are a ton of very great sports vlogs on the market today. AM Hoops is one of my favorite. Flight Mike does a fabulous job as well. Sort of a guy over at Sporting Logical. Look, there are another 100 or so really great people out there producing sports content on a regular basis, which is of high quality. And that is something that, quite frankly, when you watch ESPN and even Fox, those shows don't always deliver. Now, I will admit that I think first things first with Nick Wright and Kevin Wilde and Chris Broussard is an excellent show. I absolutely love their banter, and they have this ability to actually bring humor into the sports world in a very cool way. Something that a lot of other shows try to do, but actually fail at. That being said, the layoffs over at ESPN were not caused just by the Pat McAfee deal, though it impacted it. They were not caused just by ESPN coming down on them, or excuse me, Disney coming down on the folks over at ESPN saying, you have to save money, you have to save money, you have to save money. It wasn't just that. It was that the landscape, quite frankly, the way you and I actually receive our content has changed significantly over the years and most likely will continue to change in the direction that we're currently headed in. Look, even my dog has a sports podcast at this point. There are a lot of great places to get a lot of really great content out there. And that, my friends, is where I think a lot of this went. Ultimately, when you look at the list of people that were ousted over at ESPN, I always liked Max Kellerman. I always thought he got a raw deal when he got kicked off of First Take. Keyshawn Johnson has proved to be fantastic as his job. So did Jalen Rose. I mean, I hate to see all of these people out of their gigs. But once again, the one thing they do have in common is that social media impact. And I think a lot of these people that have been let go at this point are not being let go because of any sort of performance issues. They're being let go because of the shift in the sports media landscape. All right, that is it for today's House of Take pod. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this show yet, please go ahead and subscribe. And of course, like this video. For the House of Take pod, I'm Dave DeBach, wishing you all a tremendous rest of your sports viewing day.